Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. In our last episode, we saw Brian got upset when the American book of his autobiography, Done in America, would have different pictures in it. Brian then met up with an actor model named Dizz Gillespie, who was a $10 hustler, according to Nat Weiss. The relationship ended after 6 months, and Weiss was told by Brian to pay him off, and he was gone for the moment. By the end of the video, we see that Brian felt like his formula for success would work every time, but when it didn't, he moved on to something that might be more promising. And George Martin could see that Brian wasn't bringing in the same talent as he had earlier, and when Brian started to ask for help for his act, George started to say no. So let's see what he's up to today. Brian had an assistant named Wendy Hanson, and she also helped out the Beatles. She got an assistant named Joanne Newfield. She was 20 years old, and one of her first jobs was to go to Brian's house and over a 4-day period type out his Christmas card list. Joanne said, "At first I was in awe of him. He'd sweep through the office terribly well dressed, so handsome. The days he went to the office were nerve-wracking. The days he was absent were boring." So Joanne had bluffed her way into the job, and she got 15 pounds a week, and she didn't know how to do shorthand. When Brian found out, he gave her tapes of his letters. She wore Chanel suits, mini dresses from Biba, a white mini car with a huge daisy painted on the roof. She was the epitome of the swinging London. Brian got along well with Joanne. He started to enjoy his home more often, and he appointed her as his private secretary at Chapel Street, and that humiliated Wendy Hanson. Brian had the perfect setup. He had a live-in couple, Antonio and Maria Garcia, as housekeepers. Joanne arrived at 10 a.m. every day from her Finchley home, and Joanne occupied a small room at the top of the house overlooking the patio, while Wendy remained at Brian's office at Hill House. His visits at the office were erratic. He admitted that there were days he couldn't face contracts or business decisions, days that all he wanted to do was simply talk to the Beatles or Cilla. Joanne gave Brian more than a working day. She gave him total devotion and dedication. She was infatuated with the job, and she said she adored Brian. In the world press, Brian became known as a Beatle boss, a phrase that irritated him. The Beatles remained very special to Brian. "I hate to be called their boss. I'm their friend, and I happen to be their manager too." Nor was he entitled to the fictional position of fifth Beatle, which some allocated to him. Brian said that there was no such precision, but Tony Barrow recalls that Brian once asked Barrow to describe him in a press release as the fifth Beatle. Barrow declined, arguing the media had already so described him, and it would be unwise to belabor the point. In London, Brian rarely visited the Beatles' homes. When Cynthia and John had their first flat in Earl's Court, Brian never visited them there. John at this time was getting interested in buying fine art and antiques. John and Cynthia did make a request when they were moving into their new home. On a visit to Paris, John had seen an original Modigliani priced at £750,000. He asked Brian to arrange for a London viewing. So Brian flew to Paris and persuaded the art dealer to visit London for just a day with the painting. And Brian signed a letter to enable the dealer to get the export license. Brian laid out a lavish lunch buffet in a room at Claridge's, and at 1 o'clock, with everyone in place, there was no linen. 2 hours passed, and Brian phoned Weybridge and woke up John. He had gone to bed at dawn. He had no concern about the dealer's flight from Paris or the trouble Brian had gone to with his buffet setup. Lennon said to Brian, "Oh, tell them to come back tomorrow." Brian was embarrassed, and Brian told the dealer that he would buy the painting if necessary. The dealer, though, was expecting to meet a Beatle and felt slighted, and he left London in a huff. So Paul always lived in central London in different locations, but Brian was not a regular visitor. And George and Ringo at first shared a flat together in Green Street, Mayfair, and Brian encouraged them to move into his apartment block in Knightsbridge. The Beatles often visited his Knightsbridge flat and his Belgravia home, but could not be described as part of Brian's social circle. Brian enjoyed driving them around London to restaurants and clubs, but he was a terrible driver, and it became a joke. All his life, Brian was an unnatural driver. He passed his driving test at 19 after 3 failed attempts. His attention wandered, and when he spoke to his passengers, he looked at them for too long. He drove his open-top Bentley around the city, parking dangerously and often banged into cars as he tried to fit into awkward spaces. His chauffeur got on him, and Brian said, "What are bumpers for?" Brian was philosophical about the time his car door was carved with the word queer, and so was the door of his garage. Patty Boyd, who was George's girlfriend at the time, remembered Brian's bizarre driving. She said, "I was a passenger in his Rolls driving to Sussex. Driving through London, we came across a green light, and to my absolute amazement, Brian drove very slowly and then came to a stop until the light changed to orange and then red. Then he shot off." Patty and George criticized his outrageous driving, but Brian had no idea what they were talking about. And Patty thought he was colorblind. But Brian could get away with anything, she said. There were rumors that Brian might be willing to sell the business and the Beatles. He had talks with Brian Bernard Delfont, who with his brothers Lou and Leslie Gray dominated the London entertainment scene. Delfort felt that Epstein was keen to have an associate, and he wanted someone to share the load with him. The Beatles at their peak were enough for any one man to concentrate on. Delfont offered £150,000 for 50% of Epstein's companies. Brian would retain considerable creative involvement, and in the 1960s, that was a huge amount of money. When Derek Taylor was having dinner with Brian at Liverpool's Rembrandt Club, Taylor asked Brian if he would ever sell the Beatles. Brian admitted that Delfont offered him £150,000 for a half share in all his artists and management companies, with guaranteed veto for Brian over any proposed project. He said he was considering the offer because the weight of the work was too much. He consulted the Beatles. They were upset about it. They said they would rather break up than leave Brian. John told him to F off, which was very moving, Brian said. And it was the emotional commitment from that Brian had waited for. 9 months later in America, a syndicate of businessmen offered him £3.5 million for his business interests in the Beatles. And Brian enjoyed explaining they could not be bought, because their relationship with him could not be severed. His role could never be diluted. In less than 3 years, Brian's organization had grown artistically and administratively. Northern Songs alone announced a profit of $621,000 in 1965. Brian's profile increased through his compering of all-star TV shows made in England for America's giant NBC. Brian filmed interviews for the program Hullabaloo with the Searchers, the Moody Blues, Billy J. Kramer, and others. And Brian also ended up signing the Moody Blues. Brian became friends with Tito Burns, and they gambled together. Tito Burns took over Bob Dylan's tour. Epstein ruled mostly with his heart, and Tito was more artistic. Burns had a terrier-like negotiating skills. He was always looking for the next big deal. Brian liked him, respected his industriousness, and Tito represented Cliff Richard, Dusty Springfield, The Searchers, Eden Kane, and Jerry Dorsey. Burns had solid American names under his banner: Bob Dylan, Peter, Paul and Mary, Dionne Warwick, Bobby Vee, Vicky Carr, and Tony Orlando. During one of his gambling evenings with Burns, Brian proposed taking over Burns's organization, and Tito was receptive. Burns said the idea was a good one because Brian wanted to be free to walk about and be the figurehead. Burns said he was good at that, but his business side wasn't that great. Brian's plan was that Burns would be bought out and that Tito would join the combined company with part ownership of the agency side of it. Burns would be chairman, with Brian as managing director. Tito and Brian had many lunches and dinners together, talking over plans. Brian relished the grand plan, and Burns was hot on the deal itself. Burns said to Brian, "Let's work out all the details before we go into it. Let's not say we'll talk about it afterwards. If we can't settle the finer details before we sign, there's no way we'll sort it out later." Burns anticipated a huge pop empire where NIMS could be able to call the shots to the theaters and television companies from a great power base. Epstein and Burns ordered their lawyers and accountants to work out a deal, but there were problems even as Burns and Epstein continued their talks. Burns was a skilled negotiator who refused to have his side challenged. Brian refused to concede that he would not have veto power over any of Tito's deals on behalf of NIMS. If I'm running the agency, then my word is in that agency. And Burns told Epstein, presumably having gotten this far, I know what I'm doing. Nobody tells me where and how to do the deal. You, Brian, quite rightly manage those acts. If I say I got a hell of a good thing here, $1 million commercial for Coca-Cola for the Beatles, tell me if you're interested or not, but don't ever tell me how to make a deal, right? And Burns said Brian couldn't quite agree that he could have no say in how I did the deal. What Brian secretly wanted was someone to put his business in order and run it correctly. And when it came to the crunch, he wanted to walk into the Coca-Cola office and say, yes, I accept. He couldn't bear the thought that Tito would be there saying, it's a deal. Brian's insecure personality was colliding with his best business interests, and it wasn't serving them well. They were in the middle of having their business talks, and Burns said that there would be delay because he had to be in the south of France. Epstein said he was going to be in France too, so they could meet there and make more progress than their lawyers. They agreed to meet at a restaurant at 4 o'clock, and Brian didn't show up, and Tito went back to his room. Shortly after that, Brian knocked on Tito's door. Burns asked what happened, and then Epstein said, I heard from London that news of our meeting got out. It was known that we were meeting at 4 o'clock. Who cares? Burns said. I can't understand you. What are you hiding? And Brian was sheepish. He said he didn't want people in London reaching conclusions. And Tito was baffled. He felt he was a big star and nobody should know we were in meeting. Tito said, what's the big deal? Don't you think someone could have seen you coming in here too? That would be worse. Epstein realized he created artificial drama. He asked if they could talk there and then, and no, said Burns. He could not leave his daughter on her own while they sat and talked. They would have to wait till they got back to London. When they got back to London, the talks continued at Brian's office. John Lennon, knowing the pressure on Epstein, told Burns he hoped the merger happened. Brian continued to balk at Burns, wanting complete anonymity over deal-making. Burns said nobody wanted to sell the Beatles over his head, but it made sense to use their power as a bargaining tool. All Burns wanted to do was to go right back to Brian, ask for his acceptance of a good deal offer, and then go back and complete a deal. He couldn't quite see that. He didn't want to lose that little bit of control he had with him. Then Burns said he wanted to open up a NIMS office in New York. They would need only 2 people to staff it, an agent and a secretary, and they would get 15% commission instead of giving it away. Burns felt that a hired agent in America could easily throw their rubbish on the bill and get commission from them, as well as furthering the careers of the people instead of their people instead of ours. Burns said, why not put the Beatles out in America with Cilla, Jerry, Billy J. Kramer, and others? He told Brian, send them all in. Let them be seen. With a little luck, they'll be picked up. But Brian wouldn't see it. Don't you realize, Brian, the office will not only pay for itself, it'll make money, and you're in control. It's ours. They do what we say. Burns felt that Epstein was scared. Maybe he felt that Tito had too much confidence and was too hard-headed. And Brian also liked the fact that when he went to America as a manager, he got the red carpet treatment, and if he had his own office there, it wouldn't happen. Also, this might have affected his plan to go into business with Nat Weiss, and Nat was a close friend. When possible, Brian wanted to be in business alongside real allies. Surrounded by their lawyers and accountants in Epstein's office one night, Brian and Tito became heated. Tito wouldn't budge on the contract, which he saw as essential in his working ethic. Tito said, it looks as though we're not going to make it. And Brian said, in that case, I think we better forget it. There were too many problems. Burns said to Epstein, we're going to hate each other and it's silly. Shortly after that, Tito's organization was absorbed by the Mighty Grand organization, where Burns became a director, and he later joined MAM, the organization that ran the successful careers of Tom Jones, Engelbert Humperdinck, and Gilbert O'Sullivan. Burns said, Brian was telling me we were partners, but he was the boss. He was saying I was in charge until he said I wasn't. His intentions were all right, but he couldn't let go. Burns stated there was no bitterness. I loved him too much. I was sad. It could have been a beginning of a huge empire. But even when we were arguing, there were no daggers. He was a likable, lovable, sweet person. He was naive, but that added to his likability. Brian, he didn't consider himself a good agent. The money-collecting role was too hard-edged for him, and Brian admitted to his critics that they were right on the subject of money-making. Brian said, "I don't think I'm very clever at making money. I'm not a fool, but I'm not a financial genius. I'm sensitive, I think, and of all things which hurt me, giving people bad advice hurts most. I'm much more careful about judging people now, and quite prepared to change my first opinion. I'm not easily conned." Brian wanted to be craved as Eppie, his artist's friend and personal manager. He wanted to be able to give his artists proper attention, and big show business agencies with hundreds of artists on their books couldn't give the personal touch. He said, "If you have a gift, you can delegate, but you can't delegate and keep in personal touch." Brian's addictive streak brought in more acts into his organization, and his time became scarce. His behavior became more erratic, and his performance became blurred. He clung firmly to his philosophy, though, of excellence, and his enthusiasm remained undimmed. I will end the video here. In this episode, Brian expanded his staff, and his personal assistant to him and the Beatles hired Joanne Newfield as an assistant because she needed help. Brian, he liked her style, and Joanne became his personal assistant, and he had a live-in couple that took care of his needs at his home. Then we learned from Patty Boyd of Brian's different driving style. And lastly, Brian tried to set up a deal with a man who had a musical organization, and his name was Tito Burns. The only problem was that Brian said that Tito would be in power, but in the end, Brian could not relinquish his position as manager to let Tito and his skill help him out. He wanted to be the main man in every deal. Burns said that it could have been the beginning of a huge empire. Brian just couldn't trust anyone to do deals, and that's a shame. Brian probably could have lived longer and not have gotten into pills and drinking to deal with the stress of running a business. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would help me in the mysterious algorithms of YouTube. So as I mentioned before, I created a list of merchandise from Amazon I thought you might be interested in. And if you click on the link, it takes you to the Amazon page. And if you purchase anything, I get a small commission that is no extra cost to you. More importantly, I wish everybody a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of the Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.